guess.
Okay.
It's a captain tour.
Yeah, I remember. I just didn't know if they had one set up separately for us to keep us off the rest of the network.
No, they're stupid. Like
Okay.
We have zero support from UCF as a whole. Because I think they're kind of feeling out whether or not it's going to be successful. And once it is, they're going to be like, oh, we were here all along.
Oh, don't you love that?
Because like we had a better building, but they were like, no, we don't know who you are. So we go to the HEC.
Sorry, is it recording?
That's this whole conversation's on it.
Yeah.
What's
Having issues authenticating.
Yeah, what's the site that doesn't use SSL?
Purple.com.
Oh, yours. Yay! Oh no, that was Jonathan that said purple.com.
He's broken down.
Would you like to connect to my phone?
That might be better.
I've got them all.
Because the internet's been, I think, more oversaturated. Because our page running has seen 500 people on it.
Let's see if this works. I just need to be online to where I can send a call request. Oh, sweet. Thank you. Molly Brown, put the other one on the other monitor. Yeah. Yeah.
You good connected?
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sure. Yep, plenty of battery.
Do you have a clicker thing or do I just have to use the keyboard? Start.
This is the mic favorite link. I don't know if you want to click to your power what is that we use. But I can change the values.
All right, field test. Does this work? Yay! Okay. Good news. Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to AppSec Beyond Compliance. I subtitled it Your Guide to Not So Good Compliance. You'll see why when I get to it a later slide. Real quickly, show of hands, who here has actually done a security audit before? PCI, HIPAA? Oh, wow, actually, substantial amount of you. Okay, raise your hands higher if you like auditing and you think compliance actually makes security better. Yeah, I didn't think so. So we're going to talk about why compliance sucks. We're going to talk a little bit about the OWASP Top 10, because that's everyone's go-to checklist for, is my web app vulnerable? And it does a good enough job there. We're going to talk about good enough security and what that means and what it means for business people and what it means for security engineers. Not really the same thing. I'm going to introduce a taxonomy of vulnerability. That will make sense probably in a later slide. How to build secure and maintainable applications, and how to protect developers from their own bad habits. So if you've done compliance auditing, this probably won't be new to you, but there are different types of audits depending on the industry you're working in. E-commerce, if you're dealing with credit card numbers, you have PCI payment card industries, data security standards. Sarbanes-Oxley, if you're doing anything with a corporation that's publicly traded. This is popular in financial institutions. HIPAA, dealing with financial information. This is what I'm currently dealing with at my previous employer. and FIPS for non-military government. Sometimes you might run into all of them. Sometimes you might run into none of them, and you're working for a company that doesn't really care about security. So if you had like an online traded or publicly traded corporation that published an online app for veterans, you'd probably have to comply with all four, which as of last time I had to do a PCI audit was not really possible because the requirements for SSL for FIPS and the requirements for PCI contradicted each other. So have fun. All right, so one of the reasons why compliance sucks is it's time consuming. You have to take time away from building stuff that creates obvious value to your business, which in turn raises costs. It's also invisible. Unless you're actively being attacked, like NSA, KGB, or even, underground groups, Anonymous, Hack the Planet, you're probably going to see a lot of return on investment. It's insufficient. If you're doing compliance, usually you're following a checklist, and if you meet everything on the checklist, you think, okay, I'm done, I stop here, end of the line, when attackers are actually far more creative than that. And they're also responsible for a lot of complacency and negligence. A lot of business owners assume, okay, well, I'm PCI compliant, I don't need to keep up to date on everything because we're compliant. And unfortunately, that's a fallacy, and it ends up costing consumers more than anyone else. So I'd like to propose the compliance Venn diagram. And it kind of looks like this. So in theory, the way security compliance is supposed to work, you have skilled security practitioners who regularly test your network for risks. Unacceptable ones are reported, fixed, addressed, and maintained. And everything's maintained reasonably quickly and responsibly. And this will keep your company's security robust, and you won't have anything happen like what happened with Sony or with Push last week, and everything will be great. Unfortunately, in practice, since the companies dictate what the scope is, they typically select things they know are hard targets. Another problem is you have auditors who just literally fire up automated tools, run it on your application, and go, oh, we didn't find anything. That's as far as we're going to delve. McAfee did that for one of the applications I built while I was working at UCF. Some of them will actually have people actually test your application manually. These are one of the more legitimate companies. On completion, a checklist is completed, and you're certified. Yay! And usually they check for the things on this OWASP top 10 list. Injection, both SQL and LDAP, cross-site scripting, et cetera, If you're familiar with OWASP, none of this is new to you. They haven't published another list of top 10, but it probably won't be too different. So as I said before, compliance sucks. But non-compliance is so much worse than compliance. Let's take a look at that OWASP top 10 list. If you notice something interesting about it, is that the same vulnerability was the number one for both 2010 and 2013. 3 years of research, 3 years of security patching, people were still falling prey to SQL injection. That's just what non-compliance means. You don't comply with the bare minimum. And of course, Bobby Tables approves of non-compliance. And it's basically negligence by any other name. So, real quick, this was a quote I extracted from an article from a magazine about that interviews CIOs. Does anybody know who this is that said this line? Okay. Yes, exactly. So it was James Spaltro, the Executive Director of Information Security for Sony, back in 2007. And you can read the interview at this bit.ly link I provided here. So what happens when you say, I will not invest this much resources to project it to be a minimal amount of damage? That's what happens. So when is good enough? Well, unfortunately, to be sympathetic towards the Sony guy, there is a cost-benefit trade-off you have to make. You can't sit there and hire 2,000 auditors and engineers to rebuild every little application. If you're building like a 2-page app on WordPress or a simple Android app, you probably don't need that much investment. But what I don't think his argument's captured is that not all dollars and hours are spent the same. You can waste time and money on developers who don't know security. You can waste time on these auditors who will literally just rubber stamp anything you put in front of them because they get paid, X amount of money for approving a checklist. So most exploitation takes place at the application layer. System level vulnerabilities still do exist, and they still do matter. but most of what you see that actually gets into your network is going to be like SQL injection. Oh, we hired an auditing company, or we hired a development company that didn't know what they were doing. Somebody got LFI access into our system. They dumped our hashes, and they figured out our root password. And that's typically how the most common way things go. Or the simpler route, they literally SQLi into a reverse shell. So if you want to make your company more secure, if you want to make the world more secure, it makes sense to focus on developing more secure software. So how do we do that? It's easier said than done. A lot of people on Twitter, especially cryptographers, will tell you, don't even try, it's a lost cause. I don't really agree with that philosophy. I believe there's 3 things we can do, simple strategies, that will make software better and more secure in general, across the board. So first things first, we need to provide developers with a secure environment. If you have a compromised system and you try to build safe software, the people who compromise your system are going to be able to make it say whatever they want. And unless you're diligent and paranoid, you probably won't even notice, and you'll just commit the changes in your next push to Git. Teach developers about security. This is what OWASP focuses on. This is actually one of the most effective strategies for securing everything, because people who know something can share it with others. Education is actually the one security strategy that has the highest ROI, because when you train somebody, when you teach somebody, they can go on and pass it on to somebody else who doesn't know, and you actually make less people write crappy code. And then the next thing you can do is provide tools that are secure by default. So I don't know if anybody is familiar with me or any of my research that I do as a hobby. I go around on GitHub and Bitbucket, and I find application frameworks and publish vulnerabilities in them. Slim, CakePHP, CodeIgniter, really none of them have been safe so far. Symfony had a really weird one, but it was really edge case, so I don't really call that a vulnerability. If you want, you can come talk to me after the talk, and I'll probably talk your ear off about it for hours. So let's focus on the OWASP approach, teaching developers about security. As I said, it leads to better adoption of better security practices. If you're an employer and you're considering hiring a developer or training an existing developer in security, would you rather train somebody who leaves and goes on to your competitors, or would you rather have somebody remain ignorant and remain with your company? The more developers know security, the more hands are on deck to find and fix bugs. I mean, that's kind of obvious. There's a famous quote that everyone likes to make fun of. With enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, and then you have something like the OpenSSL bug last year, Heartbleed, or any of the other subsequent ones. Apparently there aren't enough eyeballs on open source projects. So challenges to teaching people security is that the curriculum expands every year. New vulnerabilities are published, it's just a complicated topic, and some of the old vulnerabilities reemerge in new areas. A friend of mine is actually publishing a paper and doing a talk in August about what's called a flush and reload attack. It's basically a timing attack on your L3 cache on your processor, and you can use this to side channel cryptographic applications. Well, he found out you can actually use this to also spy on other processes, including like Firefox or Google Chrome. And unfortunately, there's a limited pool of talented researchers who can actually mentor people. And it kind of creates this whole situation where the people who can do security don't bother teaching, and the people who teach don't really know it that well. Tony Turner of OWASP being one of the exceptions, because he's actually, really well knowledgeable on that. As a result, it drives costs up, and it reduces the amount of information that's shared. This is what the old hacker underground feared from the security movement. So let's talk about complexity. Since security is complex, we can kind of abstract a lot of the details out of it. Yeah, there's different kinds of attacks and vulnerabilities, but let's focus on the broad categories, not the little granular details. So we're going to think in terms of kingdom, not really species. So kingdom would be like, animal, or I'm thinking that's animal, vegetable, mineral, whatever. So I've taken a lot of the vulnerabilities you'll find in actual real-world applications and split them up into 3 categories that I think is a nice model for teaching people how to approach security who have never done it for the first time. So the first one is application logic. What is your app doing? The second one is the one that most people focus on, is the separation between data and instructions. And the third one is your operating environment. Okay, these are application vulnerabilities. There's obviously network ones, there's physical ones, and operation environment kind of touches on all of those. But let's talk about application logic. I don't know how well you can read that. Oh, it actually looks pretty clear. So this is an old comic about people who try to use, like, then a miracle occurs in scientific papers. This is kind of what people do in their online applications. For example, a shopping cart where you can skip the payment process and go directly to entering your shipping information. That's actually a vulnerability. Unless you actually take the time to look for that, you probably won't find it just looking through the code for, can I inject a comma here or an apostrophe here and get code execution. They're easy for humans to find, surprisingly. It's a little bit harder for automated scanners because you're not just looking for patterns in code. The impact varies. It's kind of biased towards the low end of the spectrum. If somebody goes on your shopping cart and manages to order $100 worth of, I don't know, fancy slippers, and you go, hey, wait a minute, I never received payment for that, you can just cancel the order. Your application was vulnerable, but you can probably mitigate it very easily. And careful planning can avoid most of the problems with application logic. So, I forgot to break that slide up. So data as instruction, this is kind of the thing you run into when you're doing security research the most. Buffer overflows in C programs, format string vulnerabilities, those are two of the most famous ones. But in web world, we have SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and the goal is usually to take over the target machine. So how do you stop, so let me go back real quick. So with SQL injection, what you do is you send a parameter to a query, and because of the way you write your data, it will actually change the instructions following that bit of information. So you actually manage to say, like in the Bobby tables example, like 30 or 40 slides ago, Bobby dropped table students, it deleted the students table. Most vulnerabilities that result in exploitation are a form of data and instruction confusion. I believe that's one of the fundamental problems of security. So if you're using buffers, use functions safely, distrust input. Don't do like Heartbleed and say, I'm going to give you 65 kilobytes of data if you're asking for one. Operating systems mitigate this with different attacks or different techniques. Write exclusive or execute, etc. Format string vulnerabilities are almost extinct, but just don't use them badly. Don't printf user variable. That's bad. With SQL, and this has actually been a recurring question on Stack Overflow, use parameterized queries, prepared statements, bind your parameters, whatever you want to call it. You separate them and send them in separate packets. You're not going to jump out of it unless you're using an old version of PHP that emulates prepared statements and doesn't actually send the packets separately. Cross-site scripting, honestly, there aren't any really good solutions. If your templating engine escapes your parameters for you, you should probably use that. If you're going to use something like a manual escaping process, make sure you keep character encoding in mind. That can really bite you. If you're a PHP developer, Twig is wonderful. They now auto-escape by default unless you tell them not to. So operating environment, this covers a lot of ground, a lot of stuff. And every detail matters, and unfortunately, it's so wide and not really that deep in relation to application security that I'm not going to get into it in too much detail. Is who hosts it, who has access to it, are you up to date, is it well designed, permissions issues, how are you connecting? All these issues are operating environment issues. If you use third-party components, that's also an operating environment issue because you didn't write that code, someone else did. And since you're depending on that, that's part of your environment. So let's take a look at how developers acquire third-party libraries. So when I went back here, let's go back to this one. I focus on point 2 for a reason because I think these two, points 1 and 3, the secure environment and tools that are secured by default, are kind of the same point in a specific way. So the best way to illustrate this is through example. How do PHP developers install Composer? Does anybody know? Does anybody know where I'm leading with this already? The instructions look kind of like this. So what they're doing is they're taking data, pulling it off the internet with curl, without doing anything else with it, immediately executing it. They have more examples on curl pipesh.tumblr.com. I don't maintain that, by the way. It should go without saying this is a bad idea. Don't pipe to your shell. Just don't. There's two things that can go wrong. One, if your endpoint gets compromised and somebody puts a Trojan horse on there, guess what? Your computer's owned. GG, play again. The other thing that can go wrong is if you're running if you're running a command like rmrf, a folder with the absolute path, and it cuts off, I think this was more of a wget specific one, but still running untrusted code, you can actually get it to where it will delete every file on your system that user has access to because it cuts off and still runs it. So yeah, it's just a bad idea all around. Don't pipe to your shell. So let's talk about secure code delivery. So most people, when you download software, I know if you try to download something like Tor or Tails, they publish a PGP signature of their software. And that does help a lot, but secure code delivery itself is actually a surprisingly non-trivial security problem. There's actually 3 nuances to actually make something secure. The first one is cryptographic signatures. Is it signed by the person who is authorized to release it? And this doesn't mean an MD5 hash, by the way. This means something like RSA or EDDSA, something with asymmetric cryptography, so that way you have a private key that only you can sign the key, and then you publish it and everyone else can verify it. MD5 hashes, SHA-2 hashes, it doesn't matter. If somebody can hack your server, they can replace it with another hash. But if you use something like PGP or GNU PG, you can actually download the public key into your trust store, and then you're secure going into the future, so long as you actually have the key on your system. It also makes it very difficult to forge a signature. The next one is reproducible builds. A lot of Debian projects are actually moving towards this. Basically, if you build it from the source, you should get the same thing as they're providing you with. Sometimes you'll have things that differ, like build timestamps. You really can't help that. But in general, the fewest things that differ, the easier it is to trust the code or trust the deliverable, because you can look at the code and see what it does, and then you can look at the deliverable and say, okay, it does the same thing. And so this is the more interesting one here: user-based consistency verification, making sure that every user gets the same thing in a way that's mathematically provable. This actually isn't that trivial to solve. So the reason this is considered part of the triangle of secure code delivery is that if the NSA were to hack, let's say, getcomposer.org, and say, if your IP address comes from Saudi Arabia, we're going to give you a different payload, they could do targeted attacks. But if you have a way to verify that everybody has the same exact piece of code that they're getting, you suddenly took that equation out. You took that out of the equation. And at that point, good luck at hacking it. If you have cryptographic signatures, your builds are reproducible, your source is open, that's kind of implied by reproducible builds, and you can verify everybody's getting the same package. In order to attack anybody, you have to attack everybody, and in order to attack everybody, you have to announce your presence. It becomes very hard to do a stealth attack with that. And if you have somebody who's doing the signing that has discipline, that air gaps their machines properly, and doesn't, just, I'm going to use PGP for win, I don't see how you would actually be able to trivially get into a system like that. So, with these 3 properties in mind, can we build a system that offers secure code delivery? Spoiler, I did. So I'm introducing a project utility I built called ASGard. It allows you to securely acquire and update your packages. Uses cryptographic signatures to verify the integrity. It uses a distributed ledger, a blockchain, for any Bitcoin enthusiasts, to keep us honest and prevent targeted attacks. And we verify the reproducibility of builds when we publish diffs and everything when we actually insert our signatures in the blockchain. And in case you're wondering about the capitalization of the name, it actually stands for Authentic Software Guard. So it's going to be free software. It's licensed under both the GNU public license and the Berkeley System Distribution License, 2 clause, by the way. We use Libsodium, if anybody has never heard of it. It's a portable version of Dan Bernstein's NACL library. It does all of our low-level cryptography, our EDDSA, our Curve 250by19, ECDHE, and it's maintained by Frank Dennis. It's modern cryptography. It's actually tomorrow's crypto. The IETF is discussing taking these primitives that are used in Libsodium and making that the next version of transport layer security. And another thing is that anybody who uses ASGard can run their own notary server. So each block is signed with each leaf in a tree is signed by a private key that we maintain. Each block is a Merkle tree based on the Blake 2B hash. Everything we publish is in the distributed ledger. private packages are available. If you have a company and you want a private package, what we'll do is that we'll give you a license key, which is actually a Curve 25519 key pair, and we'll actually encrypt it with your public key and send it to you, so only you can decrypt it and publish it in the ledger. So you get the same consistency verification, but nobody knows the details of your private software. Notaries must agree before anything is installed. That's just a fail-safe, so that way we don't have people throwing in a bunch of Sybil attacks. Oh, we have 51% of the network. We can attack it and convince people that this is wrong. Every notary has its own signing key using ED 25519. It's time-boxed. You have about 120 seconds. Otherwise, the signature expires, so replay attacks don't work. And the key is pinned. So when you add a notary, it actually pins it to where no one else can use that. Or nobody can just substitute it like if you had, like a SSL certificate. When we add a package to ASGard, we give it a detailed audit the first time through. We look for any obvious vulnerabilities. We look for anything that jumps out at us. And we go through it with a fine-tooth comb, essentially. And anything we find is, of course, we maintain to the vulnerability, or to the maintainer, because we don't hoard 0 days. Both the initialies and every update will be looked over by us before we sign off on anything. If we think the original's pretty swell, then the subsequent ones won't be looked at too carefully, but if we see anything that's obvious, like, oh, hey, somebody put a backdoor in here, we're not going to approve it. One of the things we're going to be looking for is reproducible builds, because, as I mentioned, if you can reproduce the software from the source code, you can guarantee that you're getting the right thing. If the build script is different, we mark it as, or it produces a 0-byte diff, we mark it as executable. If there's anything wrong, even a timestamp by even a second, we mark it as non-reproducible. And we also will make comments about it. So I'm going to show you real quick ASGard in motion. Hold on. So can anybody see that? Let me see if I can increase the font size real quick. Where's my mouse? Crap. Wow. Okay. There it is. Where's font size? Scaling? No. General? Oh, there we go. Sorry, it's really hard to see at this angle. That better?
Yes.
Cool. So I'm just gonna get Composer. So what it's doing is it's actually synchronizing from a notary that I have set up. I'm hoping the internet doesn't kill this. Maybe it did. Is there a captive photo on that? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I probably should have showed you the directory beforehand, but if you look at the timestamp, it grabbed Composer, verified it, did all this stuff in the background. This is just it in motion. It's really hard to show you right now what it actually does under the hood without grepping through a SQLite database, but that's the project in essence. Now let me see where it was in the slideshow. There we go. All right, so let's look at a comparison on how to attack these two code delivery methods. With Composer, compromise gitcomposer.org, replace the installer with malware, you're done. With us, you need to compromise our air-gapped machine that we sign our packages on, steal our signing key, publish a bogus package, compromise our server to actually upload it, and hope nobody notices it from the distributed ledger. Given the limited and short payoff that you're going to get, we don't see a lot of people considering it worth attacking our system. Some will try, and we'll. Okay, that sounds arrogant. We'll try to stop them best we can. So ASGard is offered as a subscription service. We're going to make a lot of packages available for free. Any package we make available for free will never be revoked to that status. Composer is one of those. More information is available at getasgard.com. Our code will be on GitHub. I actually forgot to make it public last night. I'll do that when I get home tonight. If you want any questions, you can check out our project website. And if you give us a GPG key when you sign up, we'll encrypt your welcome email with your license key. So with that said, that's all I got. If anybody has any questions, you? Oh.
Using commercial products off the shelf, fortified dynamic, and we're basically slamming input off of known lists with a load runner. Am I basically wasting my time, or is that effective?
So, is it a waste of your time? Hard to say. The attacks I'm talking about are mostly in the theoretical realm. That's something you'd expect the National Security Agency to be capable of, or any of their other partners in mass internet exploitation. If your threat models script kiddies that download Backtrack or Kali onto their laptop, you're probably fine. I haven't actually had a lot of people exploit these kind of attacks. There was now with an exception, there was a company called Push that got hacked recently, and they actually used their auto update mechanism to push out malware. I don't know if you guys have heard the story about that, but that's the kind of attack that our software actually prevents. Because if you try to if you hack our server and distribute bad packages, it's not signed by us, and that signature verification is going to fail. And if any of the ledgers try to lie about it, it just locks up and screams bloody murder until we identify and fix it. So to answer your question, I don't think you're wasting your time, but there's probably things that could be done better. So is that everything? Okay. My contact information's up here. The company behind ASGard is Paragon Initiative Enterprises. We do software consulting, application development, we do security. Give us a shout out if you have any questions. My PGP fingerprints are right here, my personal one and my business one. A little bit more about me, and enjoy the rest of Bsides.